Good evening. Oh, I think you can hear this one, can't you? It is a wonderful evening, and I want to be here to welcome, I am here to welcome you to the Westmont Downtown Lecture Series. I'm on my tiptoes here a little. Conversations about things that matter. And I am Bobby Kinnear, a member of the Westmont Foundation Board. Is the Westmont Foundation Board that sponsors Westmont Downtown Lecture Series, which began over 18 years ago, which is really pretty cool, isn't it? So the series highlights important topics of the day, and boy, is tonight's topic a topic of the day. And the most amazing faculty brings this information to you. This series is a gift to our complete whole community. So bring your friends the next time you get the word. Bring even more and more, and let's fill this lovely building out. I mean, isn't it comfortable? Lots of air. Anyway, so this is for meaningful conversations, and we want you to ask a lot of questions and have some conversation, because your speaker is here to answer your questions. So I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Kim Deneau, and she in turn will introduce our speaker. Dr. Kim Deneau is the provost and dean of faculty at Westmont. She joined Westmont 2022 and has over 25 years of experience in executive leadership in Christian higher education. Previously, Kim worked as the vice president for educational programs for the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities in Washington, D.C. She spent much of her career at Azusa Pacific University as Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer. Kim earned a Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology at the University of Florida, a Master of Social Work from Temple University, and let's see what else, even more, the Bachelor of Arts in Sociology at Vanguard University. Born and raised in Los Angeles, she is delighted to be back in California, and we're really delighted to have her here in Santa Barbara. Kim works closely with the Westmont Foundation Board in coordinating these very special lectures. Thank you so much, Kim. Come forward.
Thank you so much for being here this evening, and thank you so much for the kind words. I think we're in for a treat tonight. We have one of our esteemed professors from Westmont College, and so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Bryant. Dr. Katherine Bryant is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Westmont College. This is where she teaches in international relations courses, and actually some of our courses include international development, international conflict and peace building, international politics, and empirical political research, in case you want to sign up for one of her classes. Dr. Bryant, she received her PhD in political science from Texas A&M University and her bachelor's in political science and international relations from the University of Southern California. Dr. Bryant's research focuses on the political economy of development. In her research, she examines how the organizational characteristics of foreign aid agencies impact development outcomes, such as in economic growth rates, as well as health policies. Dr. Bryant, her research interests include international security and the role of non-state actors in civil war, human rights, and international law. Dr. Bryant has published and currently has several papers that are under review. She has also presented her research at various national conferences, including annual meetings of the American Political Science Association, the Political Economy of International Organizations, and the International Studies Association. She is a member of Phi Beta Kappa and a recipient of various fellowships. Beyond her many accolades, professional accolades, I would say that Kate is very much beloved by the students. In fact, she is known as one who goes the extra mile with her students and really invest in their lives, both inside and outside of the classroom. She's a busy person. She has a full family. Her kids keep her going, and her family as a whole, her husband, but she is definitely a scholar leader. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kate Bryant as she comes.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm guessing you can hear me. This is power. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Kim, or Dr. Danu. Thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I'm so glad so many of you have come out. I will say, when I proposed the title of this talk back in late July, early August, I feel like I didn't quite know what else was coming my way. So I almost wanted to call and say, you've changed the scenery on me. Do I still need to do this? But we're here, and we're talking about important issues. So as Dr. Danu was saying, my research really focuses on foreign aid and the politics within aid organizations, ranging from the UN Development Program to the African Development Bank to the Global Fund, and looking at how the internal dynamics of these agencies affect their effectiveness in pursuing development goals. But my goal tonight is not to get into those details as much, but to kind of share with you some of my thoughts and some things that come to my mind when I read the news lately. And so thinking about the changes we're seeing in the international system, and these changes didn't just happen with Hamas's attack on October 7th. These changes have been coming for years now, but they are growing more and more pronounced, and I think we're hearing much more about them in our daily lives. So I want to look specifically at what we're looking at with these geopolitical shifts and the connection that these shifts have to foreign aid, specifically to foreign aid as a foreign policy tool. As I said, I mean, there's been a lot of changes. I'm going to try not to dwell too much on the changes so we can get into some more context here. But I'll just say that as someone who teaches international relations, it's been a real fun couple of years. Like, open your news program and say, oh, all right, got to rewrite this lecture because Putin just threw that out of the water. Okay, thanks. So before we get started, I'll give you a couple quick comments about context and terminology. First, when I'm talking about foreign aid, I'm going to be talking about foreign aid kind of generally from the perception of Western donors or developed states. So these are not all Western donors, but we can think of these as wealthy states. And sometimes I'll refer more specifically to US aid, but we'll be talking about foreign aid in general. The second comment is that in my discipline in international relations, we refer to countries generally as states. So if you hear me talking about states all the time, I'm referring to Ghana, Guatemala, Thailand, not Alabama, Arkansas, and California. Not that they're unworthy, but that's where we're going. Okay, so the two main motivating questions I have tonight is first just to look at what foreign aid is and how it is used as a foreign policy tool. Recognizing that foreign aid is one of many tools that states can use to try to coerce or entice other states to behave in particular ways. And then second, and this is kind of the main focus of the talk tonight, is I want to look at how foreign aid is going to be impacted by recent geopolitical changes and ongoing challenges. All right, so the outline moving forward. First, I want to talk a little bit about the geopolitical shifts that we've been seeing. And then you guys are going back to school. I'll give you some Foreign Aid 101 basics. And then I want to get into 3 areas of concern. Briefly talk about the future of foreign aid, and then conclude and open it up for questions. And I'll try to keep an eye on time so we're not here until the middle of the night. Okay. I have to say, when I started studying foreign aid when I was in graduate school, I thought, I'll write a paper on it, but I'm not super interested in it. It can't possibly be that important. And here we are 10 plus years later on a topic that I really think is fascinating, so I'm glad you're here. All right, so I'll begin by talking about some recent geopolitical shifts and challenges. The overarching theme here that most international relations scholars are focused on is whether or not and how quickly we might be moving from a unipolar world in which the United States is the major power, the hegemon, towards potentially a bipolar world where the US and China are in direct competition with one another for global influence, or potentially into a multipolar world, a world in which the US, China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa are all vying for influence in the international system. So under that kind of bigger umbrella, the last few years have seen, and months, we've seen some marked shifts in the geopolitical landscape. We all know about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, beginning with the annexation of Crimea back in 2014, which actually nearly led to a breakup in a relationship for my little sister, but that's another story. And then Putin's invasion in February of 2021, and the ongoing conflict here coming up on 2 years now. We know that the situation in Ukraine, the counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces launched this summer, has stalled out a bit, and that the United States has been scrambling to provide additional artillery rounds to Ukrainian fighters, and kind of shifting munitions from South Korea and Israel prior to the Hamas invasion. We also know that Putin's aims in Ukraine are not necessarily limited to that region, but he has expressed the potential for action in other former Soviet states that he sees as part of the Russian homeland. And so that remains an ongoing area of concern. And then second, of course, when we're thinking about major geopolitical shifts, was the October 7th attack by Hamas in Israel, and Israel's subsequent retaliation and bombing of the Gaza Strip. Hamas's attack killed an estimated 1,400 Israelis. Israel's retaliation has numbered, according to most sources, killing about 10,000 Gaza citizens so far. The most recent news in Gaza is that Israel has agreed to allow a pause in attacks every day, but they have invaded Gaza, and there will be an occupation of Gaza in the near future. How long and how extensive that will be remains to be seen. But I want to highlight some other conflicts that you might not be as aware of. First is the essential the driving out of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, which we can see in this region over here. This was really an Armenian homeland in Azerbaijan. You guys can see it on your slides right there. About a month and a half ago, Azerbaijan launched a surprise attack and essentially warned all Armenians that they were taking over. Over 100,000 Armenians fled to Armenia, fearing a potential genocide was coming. This was likely just the first strike. Azerbaijan's president has indicated that he has intentions of further attacking Armenia. In particular, he is interested in the Zengezur corridor, which we can see right here, that would actually connect Armenia to Azerbaijan, to its enclave over here. So we can expect further conflict in that area as well. In the meantime, a brutal civil war is ongoing in Sudan, and we'll talk about North Sudan. South Sudan is experiencing issues as well. The capital of Khartoum has essentially been reduced to rubble with infighting groups, and there are many reports of genocidal acts being carried out against the Masalit tribe by Janjaweed government forces. Killing tens of thousands, executing particularly males and male children, including infants, without cause as they flee. In other happy news, we are also seeing more rumblings in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has seen over 6 million deaths since the civil war broke out there in the mid-90s. And the expulsion of UN peacekeepers more recently. Tensions continue to mount between the US and China in the South China Sea. That has been exacerbated by the recent fighter jet incident just last week, the hot air balloon, and the pandas leaving the Washington, D.C. zoo. And then now for something completely different, the tiny nation island of Tuvalu is contemplating if it will still exist as a state under international law if it goes underwater. According to international law, a state must have a physical territory to be a state. What happens if your state is no longer around? So Tuvalu is engaging constitutional scholars to try to address this problem. And they have plans to create a digital citizenship or a digital nation as they bear the brunt of what's happening with climate change. So obviously, there's a lot of challenges that we've been faced with in the last few months and the last decade or so. And this is to say nothing of COVID and many other issues and crises that we just don't have time to get into, or we would be here forever. I will mention, let's see. Yeah, we'll move on. Okay, so now I want to think about how we can respond to these geopolitical shifts and these ongoing challenges. These are not issues that are going to go away anytime soon. And the nature of these issues is new enough and challenging enough that I think it requires us to think more critically about statecraft, about how we engage in foreign policy. So when we're thinking about statecraft, we want to think about the tools and techniques that states use to exert their influence and project their power. Now, power here doesn't necessarily refer to military power. We can also think of what IR scholars refer to as soft power, the ability to entice or dangle a carrot in front of someone to get them to do what they want, much like I do with my 2-year-old, who has discovered lollipops as of Halloween. So when we're thinking about statecraft, we can generally look at 3 different toolboxes states go to when they are pursuing foreign policy. The first is diplomacy, face-to-face negotiation, communication, state dinners, ambassadors, the pandas at the DC Zoo. All of those fall into the realm of kind of traditional diplomatic relations. The second toolbox is economic statecraft, using economic sanctions or trade embargoes or tariffs to punish states, or trade deals or foreign aid to entice states to behave as the donor state would prefer. And then the third toolbox here is a threat of force or the use of force. So threatening military action or potentially actually using military action. Now, how does foreign aid fit in here? Well, one of the founding scholars of international relations, Hans Morgenthau, calls foreign aid a real innovation which the modern age has introduced into the practice of foreign policy. I want to recognize that foreign aid, if we look at financial flows of the financial prowess of foreign aid, it likely doesn't measure up much to trade. In fact, international trade and investment far dwarf the amount of aid that we see being given between states. But at about $202 billion a year coming from developed states, this is not chunk change. We're talking about a significant amount of funding. So I want to talk a little bit more about statecraft or foreign aid as a tool of statecraft. So foreign aid is going to fall into that area of economic tools of statecraft, and it serves multiple purposes. And each of these we can anticipate are going to be affected by the geopolitical shifts that I mentioned earlier. So the first way in which we see aid being used as a tool of statecraft in that it promotes development and provides humanitarian assistance to states in need. I think this is generally what we think of when we think of foreign aid. Someone's in need, there's a famine, there's a hurricane, a state will step in and give money to help the state out. For economists, this is going to become more complex, but you provide aid to shore up a government's budget, a recipient government's budget. Or you can invest in infrastructure projects, building a dam, building an airport, or investing in school systems. The second way in which foreign aid serves as a tool of statecraft is as an instrument of soft power. By connecting states, forming ties between states on a personal and national level, and thereby enticing the recipient state to potentially embrace the ideals and values that are espoused by the donor state. So the United States and the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, for instance, were very prominent in using foreign aid to try to draw states into their sphere of influence. The United States promising development and democracy, and the Soviet Union promising development through an alternative pathway. Now, the third purpose of foreign aid, and one that it's easy for us to forget, is that it really does shore up the economic, strategic, or military interests of the donor state. If we look at patterns of aid giving, we see that foreign aid, not just for the United States, but for all donors, really, especially major donors, foreign aid goes to recipient states that vote with the donor state in the UN Security Council, that trade heavily with the donor state, or where there's a major strategic or military interest. If there's a US military base, or if there's an important natural resource that the state needs for its national security. As we're going to see as we move along in this talk, there's tension among each of these approaches. If you have a limited foreign aid budget, how do you prioritize which of these approaches you are going to embrace as a government? And the question that states are facing really is how can they use these purposes, how can they use aid as a tool to respond to the challenges that we are facing in today's world? So my answer is kind of cheating, but I'm going to argue that it's all of the above, and foreign aid needs to be utilized very carefully and strategically by states to address ongoing economic and development concerns, to address immediate security concerns, and also that states need to remember that foreign aid is an incredibly powerful tool of soft power, and one that we don't want to abandon in the pursuit of short-term gains. So my argument that I'll be working on kind of proving to you as we move forward is that donor states should be cautious of using foreign aid primarily as a coercive and strategic tool. This is the big incentive that states are facing, particularly as we respond to the surging conflict and the ongoing, the growing potential great power struggle between the US and China. So this means that ongoing humanitarian and long-term development needs can't be overlooked in the pursuit of these short-term goals, and neither should states forget about the soft power potential of foreign aid. All right, so now we're going back to school, and we're going to talk a little bit about foreign aid. Mostly I want to show you some trends in aid and some statistics. So as any good social scientist, the first thing I will do is define my terms. Foreign aid is tossed around a lot in the media, but it actually has a very specific definition when it comes to measuring foreign aid at the global level. The main organization that we turn to in measuring foreign aid is the Organization on Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. The OECD has a special committee known as the Development Assistance Committee that is made up by about 30 states that are the major donor states in our world today. One thing that my students will know as we're studying international law is that one of the fun things about international law and international relations is it's kind of like alphabet soup. You can take pretty much any 3 or 4 letters, swirl them around together, and you will get some international treaty or organization as a result. So I'm trying to avoid all the acronyms, but these ones are necessary. So the DAC will refer to foreign aid oftentimes as ODA, or Official Development Assistance. ODA is specifically defined as having the following characteristics. First, it originates from states or state entities. So importantly, this is excluding aid from private donors and aid from multinational corporations. That is going to fall outside the purview of this research. The second characteristic is that aid is provided to a recipient state or to a multilateral development organization. It's not provided to a private entity or organization. It's funneled towards states. The third characteristic is that the primary objective of the aid is to promote economic development and welfare. So development is the primary goal here, which we can see kind of conflicting with how states often use aid in pursuing their strategic interests. And then finally, foreign aid has to be concessional in nature. And the OECD has a list specifically of how concessional loans need to be depending on the income level of the recipient state. So all that to say, if you are a developing country seeking a loan, you are not going to pay interest rates at a market rate. You're going to get a discount here. The loan has to be concessional in nature. Aid can consist of loans or grants or the forgiveness of loans. All right, so there's a variety of ways in which we see aid being provided to recipient states. Generally, we'll see aid flow either directly to the recipient through bilateral aid. Other times, donor states will give aid to a multilateral development organization. These are the organizations that I study in my research: UN Development Program, the World Bank, African Development Bank, the World Food Program, things like that. And then the multilateral agency pools these funds and distributes them to recipient countries as needed. One interesting development in the last 10 to 15 years is the increase of what researchers are calling bi-multi-aid, or core development, core versus non-core development aid. This is aid that is given to a multilateral organization, but is earmarked for a particular purpose. So in other words, the United States might provide aid to the UN Development Program, but its purpose is to specifically build bridges in Afghanistan. The money cannot be used for other purposes. There's some potential ramifications of that, which I'm happy to answer in Q&A. But this is kind of how the money moves from our donors to our recipients. Some important trends to note. In 2022, foreign aid rose by an unprecedented amount. Foreign aid now tops $200 billion. This is the total amount of aid provided by all Development Assistance Committee donor states. So the total amount provided by about 30 states. And this represented a 13.6% increase from 2021. Most of this increase has been driven by the conflict in Ukraine, so financing humanitarian relief for that conflict and addressing the resulting refugees in nearby states. So this sounds like a lot of money. Definitely sounds like a lot of money to me. Unfortunately, this money still falls far short of the goals set out by the OECD. The goal there was for all donor states to provide 0.7% of their GNI in foreign aid. Most states fall far below that. Interestingly, in the United States, the general population tends to highly overestimate how much of the US budget is devoted to foreign aid. These estimates will range from 10 to 25 to 30% of the federal budget. Does anyone know what the actual percentage is of foreign aid? Less than 1%. So we massively overestimate the amount of foreign aid that is given, while still falling pretty short of what we're expected to give. Some other trends we'll note is that we are seeing a stagnation of funding going towards areas that need it most based on per capita income and humanitarian issues, particularly in conflict zones that don't make the news and areas experiencing climate crises, and some that are experiencing both in sub-Saharan Africa. We're also seeing the rise of new foreign aid donors and new funding modalities, ways in which aid is being gathered and distributed. So for instance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, last year their budget was over $8 billion. That surpasses many states' budgets and some states' foreign aid contributions. And we're seeing a mix here in kind of new aid agencies that are combining private and public funding. For instance, the Global Fund in the fight against tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria. And the rising use of non-core aid in multilateral organizations. So here we have data from the OECD that documents this massive surge in foreign aid over the last few years, especially with the conflict in Ukraine. So you can see that 2021 and 2022, we have significant jumps in foreign aid spending. But we see jumps not especially in net ODA, this blue bar right here, but we're really seeing increases in these orange and green bars. The green bar represents humanitarian aid that is being directed to those in need because of a disaster, because of a crisis, because of a conflict. We also see a surge, particularly in donor refugee costs. So this is aid that is actually being given back to the donor state to support its hosting of refugees, many of which have fled Ukraine and are now residing in those donor states in Eastern Europe. So I don't want to diminish the fact that we have seen a massive increase of foreign aid in the past couple of years, but I want to acknowledge that much of that is due to the conflict in Ukraine, and it's been directed primarily at the Ukrainian conflict, not at these other ongoing development areas of concern. If we're looking at ODA by country, we often have two ways of looking at who the best donor is, who's the biggest donor. So hopefully you can see this, but I know it's a little small. In this column, we have the states that provide the most foreign aid as a percentage of their gross national income. And we'll see that the states that top that are Luxembourg, Sweden, Norway, Germany, and Denmark. And all of those countries get a green bar because they are exceeding that 0.7% goal that was set out by the DAC. The average for DAC donors is down here at about 0.36, 0.39. And the US is way down here at about 0.2% of its GNI. But if we look at the total amount of foreign aid given, we'll see that the US actually tops the charts. The US is way up here providing over $50 billion every year in foreign aid, followed by Germany, other EU bodies, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom. So when we're thinking about foreign aid giving, the United States is certainly the largest aid donor, but if we condition that based on the income of the United States, it's actually quite small. If we want to compare recipients of foreign aid, if we look at total foreign aid that was given in 2022, India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and Ethiopia topped the charts, with India receiving the most aid, about 4.5 billion dollars. We also have Syria, Colombia, the Philippines, and Somalia in here. We can compare that to the largest recipients of US aid in 2022, the largest of which was Afghanistan, followed by Jordan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, the DRC. We also have Yemen, South Sudan, Syria, South Africa, and Kenya. All right, so the last question in Foreign Aid 101 is this big contentious issue for not just policymakers, but for researchers as well, and that is, does foreign aid work? Is it effective? And we have some very vocal people in this debate, not just in the academic realm, but in the public realm as well. So we've got, you guys will know who this is, right? Well, Marissa might not. You do? Yeah. So we've got Bono over here, who is a champion of foreign aid. Foreign aid can solve the world. We just need to raise enough money, we need more awareness, and we can solve the world's problems. Bono's not alone. Bill and Melinda Gates followed this path as well. They're what I'll call aid optimists. Aid optimists will say, yes, aid works. And not only does aid work, but wealthier states have a moral responsibility to provide aid to those in need. Then we have aid pessimists, such as the economist Dambisa Moyo, and her book that was released about 15 years ago called Dead Aid, which is just an incredibly clever marketing scheme, because who's not going to buy this book? Dead Aid, why aid is not working, and how there is another path for a better way for Africa. Aid pessimists like Moyo will argue that aid actually creates dependencies among recipient states, and that foreign aid is actually a tool of exploitation from the wealthy to the poor. It traps them in unproductive development cycles. It traps them into producing commodities that they are not adequately compensated for. And then we have aid optimists who apply certain conditions to this, to their optimism. Aid optimists will say aid can work, but only under certain conditions. It will work when there are democratic institutions in place. It will work when corruption is not an ongoing issue, and it will work when there are sound economic institutions ensuring property rights and arbitration should there be a legal dispute about trade or investment. So most of the aid literature in the academic realm is going to come down on this third point. Most academics will find that aid works, but not all the time. And when we talk about works, like what if aid works? Generally, we're measuring this through economic terms. We're measuring this through GDP per capita or economic growth rates. But foreign aid, remember, is not just about promoting economic growth. It's about promoting development. It's about promoting national strategic interests, as much as that might not be the intention of foreign aid for many people. And it's about promoting soft power. So when we're thinking about evaluating aid, many of the evaluations of aid really focus on economic successes, even though the purpose of foreign aid can be much more multifaceted. All right. So I'd like to talk now about 3 areas of concern and how these might affect foreign aid. Probably won't come as a surprise to you that the first topic here is great power competition, and thinking about the relationship between the US and China and how that is going to pan out in the coming years. The second is the rise in global conflict, and the third is focusing on ongoing climate and development crises. All right. So a major question that has dominated the academic literature and policy space is this question of, is the United States headed towards a new Cold War with China? And we certainly see in the media, in news reports, that relations among the two states are not great right now. There is quite a bit of hostility, and the trade war that was launched, the fighter jet incident, ongoing trade disputes, tension in the South China Sea, tension over Taiwan, is all pointing kind of towards this direction of a new Cold War. We've also seen major competition between the US and China in the development field. Specifically, China rose really as an economic powerhouse in the last 20 years or so. And their use of aid has also created a profound shift here in the development field. When we're thinking about the origins of Chinese aid, many people will jump immediately to the Belt and Road Initiative, which was launched in 2013. But Chinese aid has much deeper historical roots here, going back to the inception of the People's Republic of China, whereby Mao used foreign aid to entice states to recognize the PRC rather than the nationalist government in Taiwan. Some common characteristics that we have in Chinese aid is a heavy focus on infrastructure investment, an emphasis on mutual gains for development, aid being provided not just for the gain of the donor state, but thinking of China and the recipient state as mutual partners here in pursuing economic growth. Another characteristic that differs significantly from Western aid is that few, if any, conditions are attached. In other words, China doesn't care if you are a democracy, if you have corruption. They are willing to finance projects and provide loans as long as there is demand for them. The other characteristic that we see with Chinese foreign aid is it is often accompanied by commercial loans. So there is a concessional nature of the aid and also a commercial nature. If we look at China's aid portfolio, changes in China's aid portfolio over the last 23 years, we're going to see a marked shift. So these figures are taken from a very recent book and research project from the Aid Data Lab at William and Mary College. China is not part of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. That means they don't report their foreign aid spending. So it can be really hard for us to figure out how much they are spending and where. But if we look at total aid spending from 2000 to 2012, we'll see that the US is far outstripping China, or not far outstripping, but about on par with China during that time period. But if we jump from 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative is launched, to 2017, we'll see that China is now outspending the US almost 2 to 1, a little bit more than that based on this estimate. That has significant ramifications for the international community. The spread of democratic and free market values, which China certainly does not embrace. and potentially for the soft power influence of China that it is able to exert in recipient states. If you're interested, I also have the major recipients of Chinese foreign aid. These include Cuba, the Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Nigeria. So what we see here is that China's aid and influence is not constrained to Asia. The Belt and Road Initiative has taken China to Africa, it has taken China to Latin America, and it intends to grow particularly into the Middle East region as well to access important resources and strategic outposts there. At the same time, there are some recent concerns about Chinese foreign aid and specifically financing from the Belt and Road Initiative. The first is a concern about sovereignty and debt. Recipients of Chinese foreign aid are consistently debt plagued. The loans that they entered into, they're not able to repay. And sometimes this manifests itself in the recipient state having to give concessions back to China. So the most notorious example here is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, whereby Sri Lanka had a state-owned enterprise from China finance the development of the Hambantota port. The Sri Lankan government could not pay that. In fact, the debt amounted to more than 6% of the Sri Lankan government's budget, and they defaulted on the loan. In negotiations with China to try to rectify this, China negotiated a 99-year lease of the Hambantota port and 15,000 acres surrounding the port area. We see many other areas and countries and states that engaged in, that have taken loans from China, potentially experiencing similar concessionalities in the future. Another trend here is that China has turned to providing more loans than grants. And these loans are not always given at concessional rates. However, developing states feel they are encouraged to take these loans because there are less conditions attached to them. And many of these loans, if they're provided in the commercial realm, are going to give even more debt than we are going to see on paper. If we're looking at government account ledgers, we are missing the debt that private entities are holding. We also have growing implementation problems, concerns of corruption, and Chinese firms following through. But at the same time, despite these concerns, we see China using foreign aid and the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly to expand its strategic interests and to spread its soft power throughout the globe. The Belt and Road Initiative, at last count, had over 150 other states as part of it. So it is certainly global in reach. So what does this mean for foreign aid in the future? What we see and what we will continue to see in the future is that the US and China will increasingly vie for influence in the aid realm. And aid will become a tool of strategic competition. For example, President Biden responded last year and other G7 members responded by launching the Build Back Better World initiative. We also see the potential spread of anti-democratic norms and values, and concerns about how recipient states are going to respond to debt crises. If they cannot pay off Chinese loans, does the IMF, does the World Bank come in and bail these countries out, even though they were taking loans from a non-DAC donor? At the same time, it potentially represents a win for developing states, because Chinese aid has provided access to funding and funding of infrastructure projects that the West was not able or not willing to take on. All right, so I'll move to the second area and try to speed up a little bit. When we're thinking about aid and conflict here, the big question is, how is aid going to help alleviate these conflicts that we are seeing in the world today? And there are mixed thoughts on how aid can affect conflict scenarios. One argument is that aid actually incentivizes fighting. If the government is receiving aid funds, then competing groups have an incentive to try to capture the government so that they are getting the aid to enrich themselves and their friends rather than distributing it for development needs. So here we see aid as potentially increasing both the severity and duration of conflict. Second, a competing argument is that actually aid will increase the government's ability to respond. The government will have more money for military technology, more money for weapons, and they can clamp down on potential rebellions or challengers before the violence gets too extensive. And then a third argument is that we'll actually see greater conflict, but in more localized areas. And this happens when aid donors bypass governments entirely and provide aid on the ground. This is going to make looting more appealing than governing and will create very extensive and long-lasting civil conflicts. We also want to think here about humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian assistance, as I mentioned earlier, is aid given in response to disasters and crises, particularly war and conflict. Now, the map that we have here are countries that have appealed to the United Nations and have at least 1 million people who are experiencing either a protracted crisis or they are in a crisis currently. So the purple is not good, and unfortunately we are seeing a whole lot of purple on the map. This is known as the humanitarian gap. The demand for humanitarian assistance far outstrips the amount of humanitarian aid that the international system is providing today. And many of these states are experiencing multiple crises, famine and war and climate change, all at the same time. And while we hear about the conflicts in Israel and Ukraine consistently, many of these other states in crisis don't make the news. They aren't on our minds. They aren't in front of us, and they can be easily forgotten. So when thinking about the Ukraine and Israeli conflicts in particular and how they'll affect foreign aid, we know that there's been a massive increase in humanitarian aid, but this has not been directed towards the states that are also towards other states that are also experiencing humanitarian crises. It remains to be seen whether President Biden's proposal of over $100 billion for ongoing conflict will be approved. He proposed that 4 weeks ago, including about $60 billion for Ukraine, another 15 for Israel, more money to secure the border and address ongoing humanitarian issues. At the same time, we see that American support for the Ukrainian war is waning. A recent Gallup poll showed that about 40 to 45% of the American public feels like the government is giving too much aid to Ukraine. And so as we enter potentially the second or third year of this conflict, how long can developed states continue providing this aid? We also want to think about the potential negative impacts of humanitarian aid on the severity and duration of conflict. In other words, if aid is simply perpetuating the conflict by not allowing the conflict to play out, by potentially financing some of the rebel groups here or propping up corrupt and autocratic governments. And as I mentioned earlier, other crises are receiving substantially less attention and funding, including the DRC, Sudan, and Azerbaijan. All right, the last item I want to talk about here is foreign aid and climate change and development challenges. Unless we've been living under a rock, we are running out of time. That's what the UN, researchers at pretty much every institution have been telling us. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a warning once again in recent weeks, saying that we need to move quickly, and that at current carbon emission levels, we will surpass the goal, we will very quickly surpass the goal of keeping global warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement. So this is kind of the global temperature projection from the Climate Action Tracker. And it shows that based on current CO2 emissions, we're here. We can expect about a 1.2 degrees Celsius warming based on 2022 levels. This is the goal of the Paris Agreement. If we exceed 2 degrees Celsius, bad things happen. If we exceed 3 degrees Celsius, even worse things happen, with desertification, rising sea levels, increasing severity of storms, falling crop yields, and so on. What this means is that the international community together has an urgent need to respond to climate change, and to do this relatively quickly. When we're thinking about the environment, we also want to think about development and poverty, because these two issues are intrinsically connected. When we're thinking about just poverty concerns, what foreign aid was designed for, over 700 million people live in extreme poverty. That means less than $2.15 a day. This number jumped during COVID. The hope prior to COVID was that we would be closer to 500 million people in 2023 living in extreme poverty, but we've experienced some setbacks here. Moreover, we have ongoing extreme hunger concerns, people living in urban slums, and continued inequities in other development indicators, including under 5 mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, life expectancy. So the challenge here, this long-term challenge that we have, is how do we fix poverty and climate? Can we do both together, or are they at odds with one another? Well, they're intrinsically connected, because when we're thinking about climate change can potentially reverse the gains that we've had in poverty reduction, and also limit the future capability of states to respond to climate change and to grow their economies. We also know that environmental degradation directly leads to poverty, and poverty also entices environmental degradation. As a result, we know that developing countries are going to need more effective and more resilient technology to address poverty and sustainability at the same time. If we look at who's going to pay the costs of climate change, we'll see that most of the heat as the world's temperature increases, most of the heat is going to be felt in the global south, particularly Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, these states were not the states that are emitting most of the greenhouse gases, right? That's coming from the industrialized north and China here. So there are pronounced equity concerns when thinking about who has caused the problem and who is being called on to address the problem. We're going to skip this one and think about some challenges that we need to address both climate and development factors. First is we need to find sustainable ways to develop. We need to find green ways to grow the economy, and those innovations need to be accessible to developing states. We also need to ask states to ramp up their contributions in reducing climate emissions. And then an important foreign aid development in the climate realm is going to be hashed out in a few weeks at the upcoming COP28, a meeting of states that are party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is the Loss and Damage Fund. This is really financing states that are already experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. But it's highly ambitious. It calls for $100 billion a year in loss and adaptation funding by 2030. Similar funds have been proposed before. They are still waiting for the money. And a need to address aid to the neediest states. So there's increasing pressure here for states to fund more than they can. There is a constraint. At the same time, should states not address these concerns, there are going to be long-term ramifications. All right, so ongoing challenges that we have for donors is that there are competing pressures for states to politicize their aid. In particular, for states to use aid as a tool in this perception of great power competition, particularly between the West and China. At the same time, states need to balance short-term goals with long-term priorities and recognize that not dealing with development, not dealing with climate change now is going to have important ramifications in the future. And at the same time, how can we prevent aid fatigue among donors, which we are already seeing here in the United States? One potential avenue of solution is the growth of private aid donors, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, Catholic Relief Services, and others have really stepped in to fill gaps that states have left. So overall, we know that foreign aid can be a really effective foreign policy tool, but at the same time, it needs to be used strategically and generously by states in the future, as they recognize that they have both short-term and long-term priorities that they can address through this tool. So thank you guys. I know I went longer, but I really anticipate hearing your questions, and thank you for your time.
And that comes with, those are some major advantages to build out the infrastructure, but there are also growing concerns by Ethiopians. Will their country actually at some point be colonized by the Chinese, because so much of the infrastructure is being built out, so that again, those are great things to be able to drive through paved road, but at what cost? What are you seeing in your research in terms of the long-term effects of some of that funding that's coming through Asia or other places?
Yeah, and that's a big concern that I think a lot of recipient countries are more recently becoming aware of and pushing back against. So one of the great things about Chinese aid is that it's pretty easy to access. The Chinese are very enthusiastic about building out infrastructure, about cooperating, providing workers. At the same time, they tend to take ownership there, potentially. And it's almost seen as you said, kind of a different version of colonialism. One of the efforts that the DAC has initiated over the last 20 years is harmonization between donors and recipients, and really emphasizing local ownership in development projects. China hasn't embraced that quite as much, and I think one of the ways that aid researchers and practitioners need to recognize is that recipient states are seeing the ramifications of dealing with China, potentially, and that it's not all sunshine and roses. There can be some important consequences there. And so it's up to the practitioners, those on the ground, to really push other models as not having those potential negative impacts. I know there was some. Yeah.
You mentioned the question of efficacy of foreign aid, and that one of, if not the primary ways, it's assessed by GDP.
Yep.
And my question is, what if foreign aid has a significant impact on public health? If infant mortality water pollution decreases or starvation and malnutrition decreases, but there's no measurable impact on GDP. Would that be accessible as efficacious, or would it fall through the cracks?
I mean, I certainly see that as worthwhile. And we have seen massive improvements in international society in major health indicators, eradicating diseases, improving infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates. There's still vast inequalities that need to be addressed. But one of the interesting dynamics with health and foreign aid is that some of these health issues are a lot easier to address than deeper systemic or deeper political issues. It's much harder to make a government, to uncorrupt a government, to create sound political and economic institutions than it is to provide a vaccine to a child. Not that that's always easy, but it's relatively cheap and quick. So we do see kind of this growth. Global society is far healthier and far better off than we ever have been. But we still 700 million people living in extreme poverty. Something's not adding up. That's going to take more extensive investment. And one of my concerns is that we're moving towards these short-term goals rather than looking at the long term. Yeah, Drew.
Brian, thank you very much. That was great, very interesting presentation. My question, when you showed the picture of Bono, you mentioned the idea that people believe that we should look to foreign aid, or our state should do foreign aid because it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do. If you think about a lot of the organizations that you just talked about, like the UN, the World Bank, a lot of these things developed after World War II. And I think largely the reason why the United States was interested in foreign aid was not only because it was the right thing to do, but there was a strategic reason to do it because of the Soviet Union. But now the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, so that strategic reason is a lot more blurry. So academically speaking, what are the reasons that people suggest of why we should do foreign aid?
I think we always have to look at what we say we want to do, what we're saying we want foreign aid to achieve, and what we actually want foreign aid to achieve, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Foreign aid really has been marketed as a development tool. It's the right thing to do. We need. There's starving children. There are people dying from conflict. There's not enough. Not enough access to education, and we can fix that through foreign aid. But if we look at foreign aid spending, particularly by the wealthiest states, the biggest donors, they really are spending with an aim towards development, but development that advances their own strategic and economic interests. That's why Afghanistan was at the top of the list for the United States. That's why Germany and Japan, if you look at their funding patterns, there's almost a direct correlation with how much they trade with a state and how much aid that state gets. So there is still an incentive to use aid strategically, but I think a lot of times it's couched in development terms. Great.
How would these statistics change if you took into consideration private foreign aid? So my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected here, is that those, let's say the Scandinavian countries, are at the top because they have very little private donation. But if you look at the United States and you take its government foreign aid and then you take its private citizen foreign aid, it's a pretty different picture. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, it is much more significant if we include private aid donors. For the Norwegian and Swedish models, I can't speak to that directly, but that wouldn't surprise me. But yeah, the United States directs a lot of money through private aid organizations. And some of the biggest ones, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, these are big institutions with a massive amount of funding. And oftentimes their budgets surpasses those of kind of the states that were low on the graph in terms of their funding. At the same time, private aid donations have a much different purpose, and there's certainly a place for them, particularly in addressing humanitarian concerns. The drawback with private aid, though, I think, is that it can't get at these deeper roots of economic stability, political stability. It's not designed to do that, right? It's generally designed to help a particular village or help build a project or through microfinancing. That's great and wonderful and needed, but it's not going to create long-term stability and growth. Tom?
Just a follow-up on that. Microfinancing was all the rage just like 10 years ago. We don't hear anything, or at least I don't hear anything about it now. What happened to microfinancing?
It's still there. Yeah, it's strong, it's raging. I have students that they'll tell me, they invested in some group of recipients in Bangladesh, and I'm like, great. So there's actually online forums where you can go and invest $20, $50, $100 and provide, help someone on the other side of the globe buy materials to start their own business, or what is it? Heifer International, programs like that. Which is great. We don't hear about it though, and I think it goes back to this concern with private aid. It's in alleviating immediate concerns. Is it working? Yes. Yes, with an asterisk, and I'll come back to that. Is it addressing deeper problems? No. There are also reports published in the last 5 or 10 years looking at microfinancing, issues in microfinancing loans, that they were preying particularly on women, even though they were meant to empower women, but kind of locking women into this cycle that they couldn't break out of it. They consistently needed the loan, or members of their family, usually fathers, uncles, husbands, would take the money, make off with it, and then they were stuck with the debt. Anything else? Yeah, Ruth?
You showed a picture of the top level donor recipient countries, and I noticed India was near the top, and yet we've all been told they're one of the fastest growing economies.
Yeah.
And so I found that perplexing, except I know they have a high, poverty rate.
Yeah, and to be a recipient of foreign aid, you have to be classified in a particular income group. So you look at China's on my mind. India has an incredibly rapidly growing economy. It also has a massive population, and the population is still quite impoverished. So, and it is moving up, but it would still fall within that realm of a recipient state. But yeah, I think that's an interesting data point too. Yeah.
Just thinking about a more ruthless world, and taking Jeff's question another way, you're talking about China that's aid, well, I guess it wouldn't be called aid if they maintain control, if it's capital investment in other countries.
Right, yeah, and so when we're measuring aid, we're kind of comparing apples to oranges here, because they're not adhering to those same standards, but it's still kind of given in the spirit of aid, I think, yeah.
Right, so then I imagine another gauge of effectiveness is winning the hearts and minds, or the wallets of those governments, and would a reasonable assessment of the effectiveness of, let's say, that broader vision of aid be whether they're getting UN votes, or whether they're getting treaties established, or prohibiting people from engaging in otherwise Western treaties. That would seem to be a ruthless way to assess what's given.
Yeah.
Or investment.
And I think that's something that the United States and other DAC donors are kind of, it's just clicking in their minds. China knows what it's doing in terms of its strategy here. It's a long-term strategy, and it's also establishing institutions outside of those that the U.S. and its allies created after World War II, alternative institutions where countries in the global south, countries that are excluded from the UN Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, have more voice. So like the Asian Infrastructure and Development Bank, the New Development Bank, China, even right now, China's kind of positioning itself, posturing itself as a champion of multilateralism and diplomacy, especially with the Israel conflict. It's kind of remaining more on the sidelines, also kind of moving towards Iran. That's all to present an alternative vision for the future, one that's not dominated by the West, or at least giving developing nations a choice that they didn't have before. Yeah, Jeff.
This is the second question. First of all, I want to thank you for really an expansive review of so much that's new to me. It even included some states and some world leaders that I myself hadn't heard of before. And I'm curious, one of them you showed a picture of somebody who's Boo Boo?
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, I was waiting for a Sasquatch comment, so, you know. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks so much.